As many of you guys know, I am completely obsessed with Japanese bass fishing, and it seems like every single winter around this time, I start seeing a lot of giant bass being caught from Lake Biwa from shore in the middle of winter. And I'm just like, holy smokes, like why are these guys catching these giant bass on a yearly basis at around this time? And so today I'm going to be going over the technique that these guys are utilizing to catch these fish anywhere from 6 pounds to 10 pounds, 12 pounds, and even into the mid-teen class fish at night fishing Lake Biwa in the wintertime. So if you guys are ready, let's get right into today's video. So for the past, I don't know, few years, 5 to 6 years, I've been seeing these guys catch these absolutely giant bass from shore at night in the wintertime on Lake Biwa, and I wasn't quite sure exactly how these guys were catching them. Over here in the States, when we think of night fishing, especially with swim baits, a lot of the times I would always think like, oh, these guys are probably throwing like wake baits or rats on the surface and these fish are coming up and eating it. But normally that happens in like spring, summer, and fall, and never really in the wintertime. And so seeing these Japanese guys catching these really giant bass from shore, I was very, very intrigued on exactly what these guys are doing and the technique that a lot of these guys are utilizing, whether it's fishing a hard bait or a soft bait. The technique or the action that the bait gives off is something called yotamaki. And yotamaki is something that I've talked about a gazillion times now, and even just in my last video when I was explaining how I like to fish the tiny clash, the yotamaki gets brought up a lot. And so now you might be thinking, what is yotamaki? And yotamaki basically means wobble and roll in Japanese. And that is the action that these baits are giving off. And it's a very subtle action. It's not an action that is more of this horizontal action. It's more of a flashing vertical action that is much more subtle to the fish. Now, this action is normally always performed with a bait that looks very similar to this. It's gonna have a lip in it, and it's gonna have some type of vertical style tail to it, and it's around this size. Anywhere from 6 to 8 inches is normally about the size that these guys are fishing with. Now, this obviously just happens to be the DRT, the Tiny Clash. This is one of the most popular, if not the most popular, yotamaki nighttime style lures fished right now on Lake Biwa. And just because it does a fantastic job at what it needs to do. And so that action, again, is more of this side to side flashing action. Instead of it being kind of like a crankbait where it's doing this, it's a much more subtle action. And this has been catching giant bass on Biwa for years and years and years now. And so I started implementing it into my own fishing. I haven't caught the giants like they do on Biwa, but I've also had a lot of success trying it at nighttime, and it seems to work pretty well for me. Now, why does this technique work well, and why do they utilize it? Well, on Lake Biwa is an absolutely gigantic lake, and it has a lot of different forage food in it for the bass to feed on. You've got ayu, you've got hasu, you've got biwa masu, and the one that we're really going to talk about is wakasagi. Wakasagi is very similar to like smelt or grunion, where at certain times of the year, those bait fish are gonna move all the way into the shallow beachy areas and spawn. And that's exactly what the wakasagi are doing every single winter, is they're rolling up in just absolute giant schools, and basically they're going to beaches and they're spawning. And when you have such a massive movement of that amount of bait, obviously the bass are gonna follow. And these wakasagi, they're not big and they're not fast, they're not that smart. Wakasagi are normally in anywhere from that 3 to like 6, 7 inches long. So that's why a bait of this size is utilized so often out there. So every single winter, when you see those extremely fat, obese bass coming from Lake Biwa in the wintertime, they're just feeding themselves on bait fish this size just every single night, as long as those fish, as long as the wakasagi are spawning in the shallows. So that's where you get those just extremely fat and obese giant Lake Biwa bass that it's known for. The reason why you mostly see these guys night fishing from shore is because you just give yourself that much more of an advantage. Now, you'll see guys out there waiting to get a little bit further cast if they're fishing a really, really gradual flat to reach some of those break areas where the fish are positioning to eat the wakasagi. But time and time again, basically these guys are just fishing these beaches, making a long cast, and they're just taking the bottom with these baits that are flashing, rolling, and they're absolutely catching giant bass. And so in Japan, there is a lot of different baits that are very similar to like this tiny clash, where it's gonna have a lip and it's gonna have a vertical style tail. There's a lot of them made, and the thought of some of these baits when guys first see them is like, oh, it's a wake bait or it's a crank down, and technically it's just a crank down in a sense, and guys will weight them different ways. This just so happens to be a Kasano Delrike, which is a pretty popular one again in Japan. This is an absolutely beautiful bait. I actually took it out a few weeks ago and caught a fish on it, so I was pretty stoked. But again, something with a lip, something with that vertical style tail, and it's in that 6-7 inch range. And so this style of bait is very, very popular in Japan. You've got like the Nekosogi, the DSRs are another good one. You've got like Thrash Baits make some. There's a lot of different ones, and they make them because this is what the fish are feeding on, and it works time and time again for those fish. Now, it doesn't just apply to these hard baits. We're seeing this technique as well in soft baits as well, where you have baits like the VTS 5, or you have the cramp shad, or you have any of those other baits. A lot of guys, they're throwing it on a very small jig head, and they're putting a plastic on the back, and what we call now mid-strolling, where you're shaking the rod, and the bait is just giving this flashing action. So we're seeing it implemented over here in the States, but most guys, when they're mid-strolling over here in the States, they're throwing a much smaller bait, anywhere from 2 to like 4 inches seems to be the money size. But over in Japan, those guys are throwing that 6-7 inch to match the wakasagi that the fish are feeding on, and every single night they catch absolute giant fish that I'm super jealous of. So that is the yotamaki style technique that is going on in Japan. So when you see those Japanese guys catching those giant bass this time of year, just know that they're utilizing some type of form of yotamaki to catch those fish, and it's a fantastic way. I want to try and implement it more into my own style of fishing to see if I can have similar results. Obviously, we don't have wakasagi over here, but I'm sure I can simulate that with, you know, when the shad spawn and the shad go up shallow and they spawn on the banks. You could probably have something very similar to that. And so there's a few ways that I'm going to try and implement yotamaki in my fishing, just because I love trying out what the Japanese guys are doing and having success on. Again, I'm super obsessive about Japanese bass fishing. I plan on moving there, so I'm trying to learn as much as I can before I move there and see if it applies to the fishing out here, just to show them something different that the fish aren't seeing, and maybe have some similar success to those Japanese guys. So let me know if you guys have utilized the yotamaki in any of your fishing. Let me know if you have had success or if you want to try it in the future. Other than that, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, go out there and chase your dreams.